Welcome back to the channel, everybody. We are finally ready to do part 3 of the Caterpillar 10 clutch bearing replacement series reassembly. So the first thing I need to do is get the pressure plate with the new throwout bearing installed back into the bell housing. So let's start the process. So because the throwout bearing relies on drip lubrication to come in through this feed hole right here to keep it lubed, I'm going to start out by getting a little bit of 80-90 into the bearing to kind of pre-lube it. It's something that's a little thicker than regular oil and hopefully will provide a pretty good anti-corrosion coating to the inside of this bearing until I can get the tractor fully assembled and get it in operation. I've also got some grease applied to the pegs of the release bearing yoke right here, and I've also got some grease in here on the throwout fork too. One other thing I did was the bushing down in here where the pressure plate rides on the input shaft. I did get a little bit of grease put in that thing too, so everything should be pretty well lubricated and ready to slide right in. So about the only thing I really need to be sure of is to keep this oil feed hole pointed up toward the top. I'll get the fork tilted forward, and then I will see if I can get the pressure plate manipulated in far enough to get everything lined up. Just like that. And now I can put the clutch fork actuation lever back on the shaft. And once I tighten that down, I can flip the clutch pedal down, and that should hold the pressure plate and everything in place. And now the clutch disc can be slid on the input shaft, and I've only lightly greased the shaft splines. It helps to make the clutch operation a little bit smoother if the shaft isn't completely dry, but you don't want so much grease on there that it can come past the splines and be flung out and get all over the friction material. Next comes the engine. It's all rigged up to the loader, ready to be hauled over and put in place, and I got some fresh grease put in the pilot bearing as well. Okay, come ahead. Good. Now that the engine's bolted up, it's time to get the mainspring put in. The next step now is to get the small equalizer spring installed down underneath the mainspring here. And if you remember from part 1, all of those pins and links were all seized, so I had to take that smaller equalizer spring out with the mainspring. And I've since been able to get all that stuff apart, and I've freed everything up, greased the pins so that they won't rust so easy, and I can reassemble this more in the correct manner. So what I'll do is get the anchor blocks secured on the studs on both sides. Now that I have the links and the anchor blocks attached to both sides of the engine and the limiting pins installed, I have the small equalizer spring pinned into the links on the other side, so I can now just pivot it up into the saddle and use this hydraulic jack to apply just enough preload to the spring to get all the bores lined up so that I can get the lower pin installed. And then that assembly will also be complete. Now it's time to install the floating limiter pin into the saddle here above the mainspring. That's what keeps the mainspring from being able to rear up and come out of the saddle. And these floating pins are retained by the mainspring covers. Someday when I restore this cat, I'll get new covers made and get the new leather boots for it and everything. But for now, I'm just concentrating on making this thing run and operate. So we're going to use the old ones again. These are just held on by a long 3/8 bolt. Secure it with the nut and lock washer, and repeat for the other side. Next part of the process now is to get the pressure plate springs put over the flywheel stud, so we're looking down through the top compartment of the transmission. And pretty simple assembly process. The spring will slide on the stud. Spring is held on by a nut and a washer, and they are simply tightened down until they bottom out against this shoulder right here. So pretty easy process. I'll get all 6 of the springs, washers, and nuts installed finger tight, and then while I rotate the engine over, evenly tighten all these down so as not to put too much stress on any one part of the pressure plate at one time. Now that I have all the pressure plate nuts tightened down, I can set the adjustment on the clutch brake. And I mentioned, I believe in video number 2 when I was reconditioning these bell housing components, that this could only be adjusted after a lot of this was put together, and we're at that point now. You'll also remember that I had only one of the original very short bolts left in this when I took it apart the first time. The other one was missing, so I did get another replacement bolt for that, and we'll get all that put in there. If you notice on the clutch brake housing here, there's a series of holes drilled at different depths, different distances in from the end of the hub, and that's what allows you to position this at different spots along the input shaft. And I've settled on the hole that is currently lined up right now, this one right here. That should give me a good amount of clearance between the throwout yoke and the face of the friction material to allow for enough release on the pressure plate to allow the clutch to slip when it needs to, but I also will not over travel the clutch pedal to get that throwout yoke firmly up against the friction material to stop the input shaft from turning when the clutch pedal is fully depressed. So having it all secured in the position where I have it right now should allow that mechanism to work like it's supposed to. So I'll get this other bolt put in, get everything tightened down, and we can finally seal this part up. Now that I have everything fully assembled inside the bell housing, I can finally work on getting the top cover put back on. So I made a new gasket to go under it, and I also got a little bit better of a oiling cup installed in it as well. Since this is what oils that throwout bearing via this tube, I figured I'd get a good cup put on there. It's a little better than the old cobbled on one that was on there originally. If you don't remember what that looked like, you can always go back to part 1, have a pretty good view of it. But this one has a good spring-loaded lid, and I was sure to get some new felts put down in there. That's a very important part because those felts will retain the oil and allow it to drip in. It's kind of just a very low-tech metering system. Without those felts in there, the oil can just run straight through in one big gush, and then you're operating for however long with no further oil supply. So having good felts in there is a very important part. So I'll just get the gasket aligned under here, get all the bolts put in, and we'll get this thing buttoned up. Now the dash panel goes back in. And now that I've got the dash securely bolted to the bell housing and to the fenders, I'm going to get the oil pressure line hooked back up to the gauge before anything else gets put in here and gets in my way. So at this point now, I'm going to install the entire throttle linkage control. And if you remember from part 1 disassembly, I had to take all these pieces out as a unit because these pins were seized in place. I've since been able to get those freed up, get a little bit of grease applied, and that should make reinstallation a lot easier. First, I will route the upper portion of the control through the hole at the base of the dash and secure it to the side of the fender. Now to install the lower portion of the control, slide the pivot lever onto the peg. Then I'll pin the upper portion of the control rod to the base of the lever. And then the forward portion of the lower rod to the governor end. Secure it all with the appropriate sized cotter pins, and then that part's done. Now that all the throttle linkage is in place, I can get the foot plates installed. Left side one is already in, so I just need to finish up the right one here. Okay guys, one more thing here you didn't see in the part 1 disassembly video. I've just finished installing a ground wire to the ignition switch here on the back side of the dash. And this was not in part 1 because there was no ground wire ran down to the magneto because the old ignition switch did not have a key and didn't work anyway. So they never even had a wire on there. So I found a good switch that has all the proper functions, and the key can even be removed from this one for when I'm not operating the tractor. I've already tested it out, and it's a good safety feature to have in place in case I ever display this machine at a tractor show, or just from operating it, I have the option of turning this off at a moment's notice. And guys, I'm sure you've noticed it by now, but this really ugly hole that they hacked in the dash, I can still only speculate as to why they put that hole there. One theory is it affords you clearance to reach to the backside of the ignition switch and possibly remove the ground wire and ground it right to the switch body to shut the engine off. Like maybe their old switch had gone bad, or maybe they lost the key, I don't know. But this is something that is going to be repaired eventually, but for now, mechanical repairs take precedence over cosmetics. So we'll just leave that for another day. Okay, getting back on track now. I want to install the manifolds. I have the new gasket in place, sourced from olsonsgaskets.com. Good people, good product. Look them up. Get the manifolds aligned with the studs. And secured with all new hardware. And now to finish things up on this side, get the heat control rod and lever placed back through the dash and reattached to the shaft on the manifold. Over on the left side of the tractor now, next I will reattach the carburetor, followed by the air cleaner. And then all of the piping that connects the two. And finally the air cleaner inlet elbow. And next comes the left side lower engine panel. So now I'm sliding the choke control rod in through the radiator from the front and get it lined up in this little bracket here. And then I'll connect it to the linkage that goes up to the choke lever on the carburetor. Okay, everything's tightened in, and I had to source a new spring for this. The old one was missing, so we'll see how it works. And I like that. Works pretty well. And now to finish everything up on the right side, I'll get this lower engine panel bolted in place. The heat shield goes back on next. And now the fuel tank. Now that the fuel tank straps are in place, I want to take just a second to point out the fact that I put some insulation webbing under all the contact points of the fuel tank. There was none between the tank and the brackets when I took it apart, and I don't like that metal on metal contact. So got some of that stuff in there. Should be good to go. And the last piece to go on now is the hood. And guys, I know this old hood isn't much. They've cut the hinges off where the original side panels would have attached, and there's only 2 bolt holes left, front and rear, to hold it on. But there's currently a plan actively in the works to remedy all this, but for now this old hood is going to get one more go around. It seems to run fairly well. I've made it this far anyway from the back of the shop. Clutch brake seems to work all right. When I push the clutch pedal all the way down, it does not clash gears, nothing grinds. A lot less noise comes from the clutch pedal now too, so I'm happy about that.